You are now listening to the IELTS podcast. Learn from tutors and ex-examiners who are masters of IELTS preparation. Your host, Ben Worthington.
Hello there, IELTS students. In this tutorial, we are looking at process diagrams. Now, process diagrams aren't that difficult in my honest and humble opinion. And the reason is because when you know what you're doing, it becomes incredibly easier. And in this tutorial, I'm going to break it down so it makes it incredibly easier. And we're going to look at a plan of what you're going to do. We're going to look at examples of grammatical range and accuracy, like sentences, examples of sentences and different grammatical features we can use to improve our score. Then we're going to look at a whole list of verbs that will be useful, and we're going to learn these verbs with their prepositions. Some of them are phrasal verbs, and this makes it 10 times easier. And also then we're going to look at cohesion and coherence, some more phrases and words that you can use. And then we're going to look at some phrases. And I think once you've got all of this together, once you've got it all sort of laid out in front of you, it becomes incredibly easier to to accomplish and to pass task 1 academic process diagram assessment. So although they are not the most common, we must admit that you're more likely to get a bar chart or a pie chart. However, if you've only practiced writing line charts or pie charts and you get a process diagram, then you are going to be struggling. Okay, so this is why it's incredibly important just to review some of what we're discussing right now. Now then, as you know, my name is Ben Worthington. I'm from England, from a small town near Manchester, but my town is actually in Yorkshire. And I started teaching IELTS about 8 years ago, more or less, when I lived in Spain. I finished my university. I finished university in Manchester. I went to Spain to continue doing an Erasmus year there. And once I finished that, I wanted to stay to become fluent in a language, so I know exactly the challenges you face when you are learning a language, because I've been there too. And then I started to teach IELTS. Once I got good at Spanish, I started to teach English, first with kids, then with adults, then with students, then with workers, and then eventually I settled on IELTS students because they're, in my experience, among the most determined, and all good teachers want results for their students. And if you've got your students taking a test, you can quickly test what works and what doesn't work. However, when I started teaching IELTS, I was a little bit lost. I didn't know what to teach. I was frustrated. I didn't have any idea. So I started interviewing teachers and interviewing professionals and experts and speech therapists and whatnot, and I still do today. I still do because I'm still learning. I still want to improve, and I take what I learn from them and I test it with my students, and if it works, I put it in the online course, Jump to Band 7 or it's free, or if it doesn't work, I reject it. So if you are struggling, then you can have a look at the online course. Everything that we have in there has been tried and tested. It's either I got the knowledge from experts or I developed the knowledge myself, and it's been tested and it works, and that's why we can offer the guarantee of Jump to Band 7 or it's free. But it's also useful for students going for Bands 8 and 9, and likewise we also get a ton of success with students aiming just for Band 6. So we can get you there. We say it's Band 7 or it's free because that's what most students are aiming for. So let's jump into process diagrams. So the first thing we want to remember is that if we've got a plan, it becomes incredibly easier. If we've got a plan, then we know what we're going to be doing. And I think one of the best ways is just to have a look at the plan okay, just to have a look at the process diagram and just get an overview, okay? How many stages are there? Is there an input? Is there an output? Is there sort of like a split process where it divides into two at one stage? Have a look and just get familiar with it, okay? And as with all things, I'm not a massive fan of saying this, but practice makes perfect, but this definitely does apply here. Get used to and get into the habit of describing these and looking at sample answers. And you'll see that all the quality sample answers will often start off with an overview of the whole diagram. So what's included in your overview? The number of stages, okay? Are there 10 stages? Are there 20 stages? It's good to include this in your overview at the start. Also, you want to give an idea of like what is happening. Does the diagram show the transformation of sand into glass? Does it show the transformation of coffee into coffee beans? Okay, you've got to really just get an overview. It could be even, I don't know, nuclear power generation, from the arrival of uranium to the splitting of the atoms, to the generation of electricity, and to the delivery of electricity in households. But have a look at all the stages, count them up, and have a look about what is going on. Okay? By the way, you are allowed to use words that you see in the task, okay? But when you see the description, like the title of the diagram, try and change those words. Okay, so if we see a title that says a diagram to show the production of hydroelectricity in Nebraska, we can change that to something like the diagram shows Nebraska's hydroelectricity generation process. Okay, so what we need to do is just basically paraphrase it, and we've got a whole tutorial on paraphrasing. It's an important skill to learn, especially for task 2 as well. So that's what we want to do, just modify the title, and also, as I said before, you want to use the words in the question. So if it says electricity generator, yeah, we can definitely use that. Okay, if you can think of other ways, maybe it could be engine instead of generator where it's applicable. I don't think so in this case, but if you know another word that you could use, by all means use that as well. But just remember, you can use the words that appear in the diagram. Now, if we're looking at grammatical range and accuracy, we definitely want to use either the passive or the active voice. Okay, and they really do test your ability to choose when is the passive appropriate and when is the active voice appropriate. So when we're looking at the chart, we really need to determine what is doing or who is doing what to what. Okay, so for example, do we have a worker or a laborer transferring the coffee beans from the grinder to the roaster? Yeah, or do we have a machine roasting the coffee beans, or can we just say the coffee beans are roasted? Okay, so you really need to get familiar, and I think an excellent exercise to get familiar with this is just to do the traditional exercise of transforming a whole list of phrases from the active voice into the passive voice, and then vice versa, and then back again from passive voice into the active voice. And you really want to master this skill along with superlatives. Superlatives and comparisons, these are all little grammar sort of like functions that we are grammatical devices that we need to master and integrate into our writing. Another insanely valuable one is relative clause. Okay, this is essential because we can say after which. We can start using after which. Okay, so the milk is then filtered, after which it is sent to be bottled and packed. Okay, and after which is basic, it can refer to the whole of the action of the preceding clause or sentence. Okay, so this is really useful because it helps us to describe the sequence of events. And if we're using a relative clause, then we're going to pick up points. This is one of the grammatical devices that where the examiner is looking for. Now then, also, I strongly recommend you grab a pen for this next one, and you list down all these verbs that we can use for describing a process diagram. Okay? There will be unique verbs, for example, with the coffee grinding process, for example, grinding or roasting. And in this case, you'll probably see them on the chart and it'll say an arrow coffee bean roaster, okay, for the machine. And in this case, you've got to conjugate it and you've got to modify it and you say the beans are roasted, or here the beans are roasting until they are released onto the next stage or whatever. Okay, so it's really good just to get into the habit of conjugating them, learning how to conjugate them, find out the different forms. Below, right now, I'm going to give you a list, okay, and some of them are quite universal, so you can use them to describe hydroelectricity. You could definitely use them in a process to describe hydroelectricity or even tea production. Okay, so that's the reason I chose these ones. So I'll just quickly give you the verb and then an example. Hopefully you can write them down and you can use them in your next process diagram description. So we have processed by. The tea leaves are processed by a mixing machine. Added to. The mixture is added to the raw product. Passed on to. This is genius because we're definitely going to use this verb, passed on to. After drying, the tea leaves are passed on to the next stage. Passes through. Again, so if the tea leaves then go through a drying machine or go through, I don't know, a frying machine, whatever, again, it's very useful. The clay passes through the tunnel to later form bricks, for example. Goes into. The water then goes into the main collection bowl. Flows out of. Of course, this is probably more useful for liquid, but also if we've got a lot of loose beans or grains, for example. Enters a. The mixture enters a final stage before reaching the furnace. Formed. That's genius. Formed. The bricks are formed by molding machines. Sent to. Very universal. Okay, the final product is sent to the finishing stage. Enters. At this step, the product enters the penultimate step before delivery. Distribute. Again, very useful for process diagrams. The product can now be distributed via the firm's logistics department. Stored in the. After finishing, the bricks are stored in a dry chamber. And then the final two, transfers. The product is transferred to the nearest bakery. Begins with. The process begins with the raw material arriving at the loading bay. So as you can see, lots of useful, universal verbs that we could definitely integrate into our process diagram. Now, it's okay using those verbs, but as you know, we've got many steps in our process diagram. So how do we link all of these together? And linking them together is essential because one of the criteria is cohesion and coherence. And in academic task 1, what we're basically going to be focusing on is linking the different steps. So grab a pen. These are extremely useful. By the way, before I get into the phrases, the cohesion and coherence phrases, Object pronouns are going to help you here. Because if you're using this or those or then it is then processed, you can avoid having to repeat the coffee beans are then processed. The coffee beans are then taken up to the next level where the coffee beans are washed and then roasted. If I could just say something like, first the coffee beans are roasted, then they are taken up to the next level. Following this, they are then cleaned. Okay? But we need to strike a balance between, we must not lose any sort of like accuracy or clarity during the process. So just make sure that your that it's clear that your object pronouns are referring to the actual object and that you haven't overused them. Because if we keep overusing them, it gets incredibly unclear. And I know people who do talk like this, and it's incredibly frustrating if you're working with them because they say stuff like, put them over there next to the other ones, just right after the ones you did before that the other day. Okay, small exaggeration there, but this is what I mean. You need to find a balance between, on the one hand, repeating the object to repeating coffee beans, for example, excessively, or being too vague with the example I just gave. So find a balance. Now, we're going to use object pronouns, as I just said. Then we're also going to use some linking phrases such as following this, or following this step, or followed by. And then we can also use then. All right, so it's a very useful one. And also, just final couple, first, second, and finally will help you a lot. Okay, first, the coffee beans are washed. Second, they then go into a machine where they are selected. And finally, they are dried in the roasting rack, so to speak. Okay, so just an example off the top of my head there. Also, another very useful phrase, which you will have to use most likely, is after this step is completed. After this step is completed, the beans are then taken to the packaging department where they are processed further for final delivery. Okay, so let me just recap what we've gone over so far. We're going to give an overview. We're going to first plan how many stages, what is happening, who's doing what to what. We're going to look at the number of stages. We're going to look at the process in general, see what goes in, see what goes out, see what the finished product is, or if it's a cycle. We're also going to review and look for opportunities for the passive and active voice and be very aware of what's happening. If we can, we're going to use a relative clause, after which we'll probably score a lot of points. Also, we're going to use the list of verbs, specific verbs, passed into, passes through, goes into, flows out of, sent to, distributed, and so on and so forth. Then we're going to use the phrases we just mentioned, following this step, followed by, first, second, and finally, and then after this step is completed. And then, to further help with our lexical resource score, I'm going to give you some phrases, which again are universal phrases. They're very practical, and the examiner will be expecting these. So, some beautiful ones. For some beautiful ones, we can start with a multi-step process. The diagram shows a multi-step process of the production of coffee beans in Ethiopia, for example. The process starts with coffee beans being grown in the hills and ends with packaging and distribution, for example. So a multi-step process. The process starts with XYZ and ends at XYZ, or ends with XYZ. Again, another useful phrase. We have a 6-step process whereby water undergoes a purification process. Whereby is another useful term we can incorporate into our essay. Another one, which causes it to. Okay, now we are getting to the level of explaining it at a higher level. The beans are then soaked in water, which causes them to release the properties necessary for the next stage. For example, if we can add that, that's fantastic. Next phrase, the final product is sent to the finishing stage. Okay, just a mixture of the last few phrases. The final product or the final product is sent to the distribution stage. The final product is sent for further processing. So again, we've got the final, which helps with our cohesion and coherence because we've got the end of the stage, and we've already hopefully mentioned the first and the second and the other stages preceding that. Then we've got the verb I just mentioned, sent to, very useful to show the direction. And then we've got the end, again, the finishing stage. A very useful stage then. Obviously, it has to be relevant. Maybe if we're talking about hydroelectricity, we're obviously not going to talk about the final product. So we have to adapt it. So we could say the final stage is sending the water to the generator for electrical production, for the production of electricity. Some more useful phrases. It consists of, it consists of 8 steps starting with coffee bean selection and ending with coffee bean packaging, or with the packaging of the coffee beans. Okay, if we're talking about milk production, it could be, it consists of 7 steps, starting with cows grazing in the field and ending with milk products being stored in supermarkets and shop shelves. Okay, so there we go. We've got a very brief and practical overview of how to describe a process diagram for academic task 1 IELTS. Now we go into this in much more detail in the online course. We have a few modules on this. We give you more phrases, more sentences, and also not just for process diagram, but we've got pie charts, we've got line charts, we've got the maps, all the different possible tasks are covered. So if you're struggling with academic task 1, you want to improve faster, then have a look at the online course. We've got feedback in there. So it's very easy for you to improve. We give you the modules, we say do the exercises, send in your essay, and then we'll see if you are using the knowledge that we impart, that we teach in the course, but also we're going to check on your language skills. So we've got both bases covered for you, and it's very difficult not to improve if you're following this process. So that's it for me today. Have a fantastic day, and I wish you the best with your IELTS preparation and all the best for the future. And remember, if you are stuck, please get in contact. We can help you. Just go to IELTSpodcast.com, and there you'll be able to sign up for our email list. And then on the email list, you get special offers. And we've also got a special offer at the moment for speaking feedback. So you can go to the site and have a look at that. So good luck with your IELTS preparation. And I wish you the best and all the best for the future. Take care.
Thanks for listening to IELTSpodcast.com.